Emergency call from Outpost 4. The USS Enterprise is moving to investigate and assist.
Outpost 4 reported under attack, sir.
They wore Starfleet uniforms and spoke of peace among the stars, but off-camera, the men and women of the original Star Trek crew lived lives every bit as unpredictable as anything they faced on the Enterprise. There were near-poverty years, secret war wounds, quiet acts of heroism, and at least one moment so bold it still gets talked about decades later. This is the story of the humans behind the legends, the actors who turned a low-budget 60s space show into a cultural phenomenon, and who each carried their own extraordinary story long after the cameras stopped rolling. Long before he was barking orders from the captain's chair, William Shatner was a classically trained stage actor out of Montreal, cutting his teeth at prestigious theater festivals and eventually making his way to Broadway. Hollywood, though, was not kind to him at first. Small parts came and went, and there was a stretch where Shatner's finances got so thin that he reportedly slept in his truck between acting jobs, taking almost anything offered just to stay afloat. Then came Captain James T. Kirk. When Star Trek premiered in 1966, it wasn't an instant sensation, but Shatner's magnetic, sometimes theatrical performance gave the show a gravitational center. Kirk was bold, impulsive, and deeply human, and Shatner's willingness to lean into that emotional volatility helped the character become an icon that outlasted the show's modest 3-season run. His career didn't stop there. Shatner reprised Kirk across 7 feature films, stepped behind the camera to direct one of them, and later found major success playing brash lawyer Denny Crane on both The Practice and Boston Legal, a role that earned him 2 Emmy Awards. He also built a strange and beloved side career recording spoken-word music albums and writing science fiction novels. Even in his 90s, Shatner keeps showing up. He became the oldest person to fly to space when he rode aboard a Blue Origin suborbital flight in 2021, proving that the man who played a starship captain was still chasing the real thing well into old age. Leonard Nimoy grew up in Boston and spent years bouncing between westerns and cheap horror pictures before a role came along that would define the rest of his life. As Mr. Spock, the half-Vulcan science officer torn between cold logic and buried emotion, Nimoy created one of the most recognizable characters in television history. That fame came with a cost. Nimoy grew so tied to Spock that he felt swallowed by the role, prompting him to write a memoir in the 1970s bluntly titled, I Am Not Spock. Fans were unsettled by the title, reading it as a rejection of the character they loved. 2 decades later, Nimoy released a follow-up, I Am Spock, reflecting a more peaceful relationship with the role that had made him famous, acknowledging how much of Spock's search for balance mirrored his own. Nimoy's fingerprints are all over the franchise beyond acting. He directed 2 of the original film series' most acclaimed entries, and he had real influence over casting and storytelling decisions during some of the show's most important years. Away from Star Trek, he pursued photography, poetry, and music, and directed the hit comedy 3 Men and a Baby. In his later years, he became an outspoken advocate for lung health after his own struggle with chronic illness tied to decades of smoking. When he passed away in 2015, the tributes made clear that fans weren't just mourning Spock, they were mourning a genuinely thoughtful artist. DeForest Kelley grew up in Georgia dreaming of becoming a real doctor, a path that closed off when he couldn't afford medical school. Acting became his fallback, and for years he built a solid career playing villains in television westerns. It wasn't the kind of work that reflected who he actually was. Kelley was warm, introspective, and quietly funny, traits that had little outlet in the tough guy roles he kept landing. That changed in 1966 when he was cast as Dr. Leonard Bones McCoy. Kelley was initially hesitant about attaching himself to a science fiction series, but McCoy's sharp wit paired with genuine compassion made him the emotional anchor of the show, balancing Kirk's boldness and Spock's detachment. Kelley returned for all 6 of the original crew's feature films and made a memorable cameo as a 137-year-old Admiral McCoy in the pilot of Star Trek, The Next Generation. Notably, Kelley made a deliberate choice to avoid chasing other major roles that might overshadow McCoy, instead dedicating himself to convention appearances and mentoring younger actors in the franchise. When he died of stomach cancer in 1999, part of his ashes were later sent into space alongside those of castmate James Doohan, a fitting final journey for a man who spent decades guiding others through the galaxy. Before he ever set foot on a soundstage, James Doohan was a real-life soldier. Born in Vancouver, he served with the Royal Canadian Artillery and stormed Juno Beach on D-Day. That same night, he was accidentally struck by gunfire from a fellow Canadian soldier, hit multiple times, including a shot that cost him a finger and another that was stopped by a cigarette case in his pocket, sparing his life. That real-world grit shaped the character he'd later become famous for, Montgomery "Scotty" Scott, the Enterprise's endlessly resourceful chief engineer. Doohan gave Scotty his thick Scottish accent as a tribute to soldiers he'd fought beside during the war, and he became so skilled at hiding his missing finger on camera that most viewers never noticed. Off-screen, Doohan's legacy went beyond entertainment. He once received a heartfelt letter from a struggling fan who was contemplating suicide, and rather than brush it aside, he invited her to meet him and stayed in touch with her for years. She eventually turned her life around and went on to earn an engineering degree, a story Doohan later called the most meaningful moment of his life. More meaningful, he said, than any role he ever played. When he died in 2005, some of his ashes were launched into orbit and later made their way aboard the International Space Station, a final tribute to a man who spent his life pointing others toward the stars. George Takei's casting as Lieutenant Hikaru Sulu was quietly radical for its era. At a time when Asian American actors were mostly offered stereotypical or minor parts, Takei played a confident, capable Starfleet officer, sending an unmistakable message about representation during the height of the civil rights movement. Takei's own life had already been shaped by injustice long before Star Trek. As a child, he and his family were forced into internment camps during World War II simply because of their Japanese ancestry. He carried that experience with him for the rest of his life, eventually turning it into art through his graphic memoir and stage musical, both of which introduced new generations to a painful chapter of American history. In 2005, Takei publicly came out as gay, a decision that carried real risk for a public figure at the time. He has since become one of the most visible advocates for LGBTQ+ rights in entertainment, using humor and sharp commentary to challenge prejudice both online and in person. Between his activism, his storytelling, and his enduring wit, Takei has used his Star Trek fame as a launching pad for causes far bigger than science fiction. Walter Koenig joined the Enterprise crew in the show's second season as the young, enthusiastic ensign Pavel Chekhov, a character partly designed to appeal to younger viewers and to gently poke fun at Cold War tensions by including a proud Russian officer on an American-led ship. Koenig leaned into the character's earnestness, turning Chekhov into a scene stealer despite often limited screen time, and his role expanded significantly in later films. Off-screen, Koenig proved to be one of the more literary members of the cast, writing an episode for the animated Star Trek series and later publishing his own novels. He also found a very different kind of role playing the cunning telepath Alfred Bester on the rival science fiction series Babylon 5, showing a darker range few fans expected from him. Koenig spent years teaching acting and quietly supported human rights causes, including advocacy work tied to political prisoners abroad, a far cry from the wide-eyed young officer fans remember from the 60s. Few people shaped Star Trek's DNA as much as Majel Barrett. She was originally cast as Number 1, a stoic second-in-command in the show's very first pilot, but network executives balked at the idea of a woman holding that much authority, and the role was scrapped. Rather than walk away, Barrett returned as Nurse Christine Chappell, bringing warmth and quiet depth to sickbay. Her most lasting contribution, though, may be a voice rather than a face. Barrett provided the voice of the ship's computer across nearly every Star Trek series for decades, making her the only performer with a presence in almost every era of the franchise. In 1969, she married Star Trek creator Gene Roddenberry, and after his death she became the guardian of his creative legacy, shepherding Star Trek, the next generation into existence and helping steer the franchise's revival in the 1990s. She also took on the memorable recurring role of Lwaxana Troi, an unapologetically bold older woman who defied the usual sideline portrayals older female characters received on television. When Barrett died in 2008, her ashes were sent into space alongside her husband's, a fittingly cosmic ending for the woman fans still call the First Lady of Star Trek. Ricardo Montalban's Khan Noonien Singh began as a guest role in a single first-season episode, but the character's magnetism was impossible to contain. Montalban, born in Mexico City, brought a theatrical intensity to Khan that made him one of television's most compelling villains, and when the character returned for the feature film Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, he became a legend. Montalban was in his early 60s during filming but appeared in remarkably strong physical shape, sparking rumors that his muscular frame was achieved with prosthetics. The film's director later confirmed it was entirely real. Notably, Montalban never shared a physical set with William Shatner during filming due to scheduling conflicts. All of their intense confrontations were filmed separately and pieced together through video screens, an unplanned choice that only heightened the tension between the two characters. As a Mexican-born actor navigating an industry that offered few substantial roles to Latino performers, Montalban brought real personal weight to Khan's themes of exile and wounded pride, turning what could have been a standard sci-fi villain into something far more layered and human. John Delancey stepped into Star Trek, The Next Generation in its very first episode as Q, an all-powerful, endlessly unpredictable being from beyond normal space and time. Rather than a typical antagonist bent on destruction, Q existed to test humanity, forcing Captain Picard and the crew to defend their worth against his cosmic mind games. Delancey's casting story has become something of legend itself. He actually missed his first audition and had to be given a second chance, which he made count. His performance was compelling enough that Q evolved from a planned one-off appearance into a recurring fixture across multiple Star Trek series. His scenes with Patrick Stewart carried a theatrical energy that fans still point to as some of the franchise's sharpest writing. Outside of Star Trek, Delancey has kept busy with a wide-ranging career, including a memorable stint on Breaking Bad and voice work as the chaos-loving Discord on My Little Pony. Friendship is Magic, a role that let him channel a very Q-like sense of mischief for an entirely new generation of viewers. And now, the story fans still bring up decades later. Nichelle Nichols, born in Illinois, made television history as Lieutenant Nyota Uhura, the Enterprise's communications officer. At a time when black actors were rarely given roles of real authority on American television, Uhura commanded respect on the bridge as a skilled officer, not a stereotype. Her on-screen kiss with Captain Kirk became one of the most talked-about moments in television history, widely remembered as one of the first interracial kisses ever broadcast on American TV. But it was a separate, far bolder moment that cemented Nichols as more than just a groundbreaking television character. In the late 1960s, she posed for a series of daring photographs that showed a side of her the buttoned-up Starfleet uniform never revealed, confident, glamorous, and strikingly sensual. For an era that carefully policed how black women were allowed to be portrayed in media, the images were a jolt. They didn't fit the respectable officer image audiences had grown used to, and that was exactly the point. Nichols wasn't interested in being boxed into one version of herself. She wanted to prove that a woman could be a symbol of intelligence and authority and, in the same breath, own her sensuality without apology. Fans who only knew her as the composed voice on the bridge were stunned to see her step so fully outside of Uhura's shadow. That boldness wasn't just personal, it rippled outward. Nichols went on to spend years working directly with NASA to recruit women and people of color into the astronaut program, efforts credited with helping bring Sally Ride and Guyon Bluford into the space program as trailblazers in their own right. Nichols very nearly walked away from Star Trek altogether early in its run, frustrated by how little her character was allowed to grow. It took an encounter with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who reportedly urged her to see her presence on screen as something bigger than a job, a symbol that mattered to millions of viewers who rarely saw themselves represented with dignity. She stayed, and the decision changed the course of television history. When Nichols passed away in 2022, she left behind a legacy that reached from Hollywood soundstages to actual NASA launch pads, and a reminder that sometimes the boldest thing a person can do is simply refuse to be only one thing. Taken together, these 10 stories reveal something the show itself always tried to say: that courage doesn't only look like a phaser battle or a first contact with an alien species. Sometimes it looks like a war veteran hiding his injuries to keep working, a child of internment camps finding his voice decades later, or an actress refusing to be defined by a uniform. The cast of Star Trek spent years pretending to explore the final frontier, but off-screen, in ways just as dramatic, they were quietly redefining what was possible in their own lives and in ours.